Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Programming and Access 2013. My name is Steve Bishop, and today we're going to be continuing our series on VBA, or Visual Basic for Applications. More specifically, today's video is going to be on access modifiers. Now, we've used access modifiers in the past, but I've just kind of skipped over their meaning. I've just told you to go ahead and type it out, but don't worry about it, and we'll talk about it later. Well, now's the time to go ahead and talk about them. Access modifiers limits the access to elements such as methods and variables. So element, you haven't seen me use the word elements just yet, but as elements are essentially a word that Microsoft uses in order to talk about anything and everything that is in your VBA code, such as functions, subroutines, properties, variables. Anything you write in your VBA code is essentially an element. So access modifiers limit the access to those elements. The first one that we're going to talk about, the first access modifier that we're going to talk about is public. And you may recall me using this public term in the past. And we would use these to declare something like a public function. So public function, function name, and then we'd say as string or as some sort of value type. So public is basically setting the access to that function. And public makes it so that elements can be accessed from code anywhere in the same project, and also from other projects that reference the project. One of the neat things about access is that you can actually write your code in one database and then add that database as a reference in another database. And you can use your code that you wrote in that new database. So you don't have to go back and rewrite everything. You could just make a reference to another database. This is really nice. This is kind of convenient when you don't really want to retype everything or you don't want to copy and paste everything over. I don't really see too many times that another application references another database. It's just so rare, but it is a possibility. The other access modifier that you've seen me use is the private access modifier. And private basically makes it so that elements can be accessed only from within the same module, class, or structure. So unlike the public access modifier, private is very, very limiting on who can access it, what other parts of your code can access that function, subroutine, or variable. The other access modifier that you might see occasionally is global. Now, global has not been it's not deprecated too much. You still might see it occasionally, especially if you're working on an older database, one that was written, say 5 years ago, something like that. The global keyword is still used occasionally, but it's essentially the same as public, except you can only use it on variables, and you can't use it within object modules or classes. You can only use it under very, very strict circumstances. When you're creating a module that's all by itself, not in any way associated with a form or report or anything like that, and you can't use it within a class. You have to declare a very separate, specific module that you're putting your functions in. Then you can declare a global variable. Okay, and again, you can only use it on a variable. You can't declare it on your subroutines or functions. Then there's the friend access modifier, and I debated whether or not to even mention friend because it is so rarely used that it's almost not even worth discussing. However, I thought there might be the off chance that you might see it, so you can at least understand what it's talking about, what a friend access modifier is for. And a friend access modifier basically makes it so that elements can be accessed only from code within the same project. And the code can only, basically the friend modifier can only be used in object modules and classes. So you can't use friend in that separate module that I was talking about when I was talking about the global access modifier. Friend is used in basically the exact opposite circumstances. You can only use it when you're talking about object modules and classes. And friend also makes it so that those functions or subroutines they can't be accessed from another project. Okay, so it's very, very similar to public, except you can't use it from another project. All right, so those are some of the access modifiers you might run across. I'll tell you right now, though, that I have never really had to develop any application that used anything other than public and private. There may be circumstances that you might use global occasionally. Friend you might use if you're really concerned about other people making a database that's working off of code that you've written before. But honestly, public and private are the only two that I really use and that you'll probably ever need to use. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of these in use and how we can use them. All right. So first I'm going to talk about this public access modifier that I've declared in front of this function called public test. You'll notice that we're declaring our function as public, and this means that not only in this code that we've written here is this public test function available, but I can access it from other modules. So say for example here in my mod test 2 module, or even from within a form here. So I can go into this and type in something like mod test, and we can see there's our public test function. And you'll notice here that what I've done is I've actually started by typing out mod test, and then I use the dot in order to look at the different to get the IntelliSense to show me what my different functions and variables were available to me from the mod test. So this is really neat. This is a neat functionality of access. Again, in the mod test module, I've got a public function called public test declared, and I'm going to another location, which in this case was the form, and I can actually use the mod test class name or module name to start my drill down in to find my public test. All right, so that's pretty cool. That's definitely really, really nice. I'm going to go ahead and backtrack this here because I have this set there for a reason. And you can see I'm going to go ahead and type mod test dot public test. So I'm drilling down to the mod test module, and I'm going to go ahead and call that public test function, which is declared as a public function. And the public test function is going to return back a value of public access modifier. All right. So when I run this, I should get print out public access modifier, exactly how we anticipated. All right. So again, this debug print basically calls this function and prints out to our immediate window whatever the value was that was returned from this function. Okay. So I can drill down, call that function. That's all great. Now let's talk about the private modifier. So I've got this function called private test, and it's going to return back private access modifier to whoever the caller was of this function. So private now is the access modifier I've set to the private test function, and so I'm going to go back in here and I'm going to try to drill down to it. So I'm going to do mod test, and I hit my period, and you notice the private test function is not available. I can't see it anywhere. So okay, well, let's just assume maybe it's something wrong with access. So I'm going to go private test is what I'm going to do anyway. Oops. Private test. Okay. And you'll notice that, oh, well, see? No, there we go. Even though the IntelliSense didn't find it, it changed it for me. So I'm sure that's going to work now. Well, guess what? No, it doesn't. Okay, method or data member not found. But we know that private test is a function that is here. It's right there. We've declared it. But because we've used the private keyword as the access modifier for this function, it is not available from anywhere outside of this this module. I'm going to stop my code right there, and you'll notice that I have this other public function that I'm declaring called call to private test, and from here I can in fact call the private test function. So now what I'm doing is I'm going to go ahead and call my public function called call to private test, and I'm going to set its value to whatever the value returned from private test is. But because I'm declaring this public function from within the same module here, within this screen window, which is the same module that houses this private function called private test, this private test call is available to me. I can call it from within this module. I just can't call it from anywhere else. This is it. This is the only place I can call that private test function. So I'm going to go ahead and set a breakpoint here, and we'll follow along here. I'm going to go ahead and drill down to call to private test, and now I'm going to run my printout subroutine here. So debug print mod test call to private test and see what we get here. So we're going to jump to our public function called call to private test, and it is going to return a value as a string. So we're setting the variable call to private test equal to whatever the value returned from private test is, which jumps us up to the private function. So now we are gaining access to that private function called private test. It's setting the value of private test to private access modifier. Okay. Going to go ahead and return back all the way back to our debug print request, our print out subroutine, and notice that down here on our immediate window, private access modifier has been printed out on our immediate window. And again, that was what we saw was labeled within our private function called private test. There's our private access modifier, private access modifier. All right. So the only way we can get to this private test function is if we call it from somewhere within this code, and that's why we had to create this public function called call to private test. All right. So that's public and private. But I'm going to show you a neat little thing here. Remember how in a previous video when we were talking about going through a select case and we declared this operator string in order to determine which function we were going to run on two different values? And if you remember, we used the dim keyword here. Well, one of the things that you may not know is that dim and private are interchangeable in this particular case. When you're declaring a variable, you can use private or you can even use public. Oops. Okay. Oops. If I could not fat finger it there. Okay, there we go. So we can use private or public in order to declare a variable. Okay. Now, private and dim are basically the same thing when we're declaring the variable, but notice though that I cannot change this one. For example, I've got this subroutine called whatever down here. I cannot dim a subroutine. I'm going to get an error here. I can only dim a variable, but I can use the private keyword to declare a variable that I want private to this particular module. Remember, the private keyword makes it only to the local. So dim or private are interchangeable in this particular circumstance. And the common practice, just so that you know this, is that we use the dim keyword when we are declaring a variable from within a function or subroutine. You'll see the dim keyword used here, but you will see the private keyword used when it is declaring a variable outside of your functions and your subroutines. Okay, so that's just the common practice. You can do a dim if you'd like we had before when we were demonstrating in the previous video. but normally you will see the keyword private used. Okay? All right, so now this is a good example of the global access modifier. So I've got the str test string that I'm declaring here as a global variable and is of type string. Now remember, the global variable is very similar to public in that I can access it from anywhere within my database. So I'm going to go ahead and go here. I'm going to type in, mod test, and you'll see there's my str test variable. And I can go ahead and set its value. So mod test, str test equals whatever. And now when we print out the str test, when I run my printout function or subroutine here, we get the return value of whatever, because that's what I set the value of the str test variable. All right. I could also use the public keyword to declare my str test, and you'll see that it works essentially the same way. I'll even show you. If I dot down, there's the str test variable. I can set it to whatever, delete that out, and sure enough, we get the same results. So public and global are very, very similar. And that's why I said you hardly ever see global anymore, because public is so much more common and does essentially the same thing. Okay, go ahead and return that back for posterity measure there. All right, now functions are, the friend access modifier is a bit trickier. I went ahead and went into my form here and I declared a friend function called friend method test. All right, and it is going to return a string that is friend function modifier. Okay, so again, this is in my form_frm form. I'm going to go to my mod test here, and let me delete this out of here. And instead of calling mod test, as a matter of fact, you know what? Before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and show you that if I try to copy this, if I go ahead and friend function, I'm going to copy this and I'm going to put this in my mod test here. You'll notice that it's red. I get an error here. Oh, sorry about that. Let me delete that out here. Sorry, that's not necessary. It's an artifact. But you'll see here syntax error. Okay, it's because the friend access modifier cannot be used in a module that is separate from a form or from a class. I can use the friend access modifier if I'm in a class. Okay, I'm going to get rid of it here so we don't error out when we do our debug here. You'll notice that we compile just fine with the friend access modifier in a class. We also have it declared here in our form, okay? And when we debug, we compiled it, we didn't run into any problems. So that's great. So what I'm going to do is, I'm in the wrong place here. There we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and call that friend function. That again, I'm just to show you here in the friend function called friend method test. We're going to return a value of friend function modifier. So we need to drill down to that function, form, frm, form, dot, friend method test. Okay, so even with the method being on our form, on the module on our form, I can still go ahead and drill down to it if I call the form object and then use the period in order to drill down to our function that we declared in there. So now when I do print out, sure enough, friend function modifier. So friend is very similar again to the public keyword. It just makes it so that we can only declare it within a class module or within our class objects here for access. We cannot declare it in our modules. All right, I hope that makes sense to you. And again, also the friend access modifier makes it so that other databases cannot view those functions. So this function here on our form called FRM form, this friend method test function would not be available from another database. All right, I hope that all makes sense to you. If you have any questions about this video, please feel free to put a comment below, or you can send me an email and I can address your question a little bit more directly. And if you have any other video ideas or suggestions that you'd like to see, please feel free to send me an email on those as well.